Good morning, everyone. For writing today, I have a little video here to help you with the last piece of revising that we need to do before we're ready to move on to editing our stories. And today we're going to revise our stories for interesting verbs. Now, if you don't know what a verb is, I made a little chart for you. A verb is an action word. It's something that you can do. Some way to describe how you're moving, what you're doing, what you're seeing. It's anything that can describe what you're doing or how you move. So on my chart, I have a few examples. I have run, sat, eat, smile, walk, throw, burp, sneeze, and hop. So these are all things that you can actually do. You actually can burp. You really can smile. You can throw. You can sneeze. You can hop. You can run. These are things that you can do. Now, it's important to know what a verb is, an action word, because we're going to revise for interesting verbs today. So I'm going to show you how to do that by reading through one of the stories from our classes. This is actually the story from the A group, so kids in the Monday, Wednesday cohort. And we're going to read through and see if we can find some verbs, so things that someone can do. When we find those verbs, if they need to be changed to be more interesting, I'd like you to highlight them in pink. So for example, once a tiny black and brown bear was sitting on the white chair in a living room. Okay, the verb in this sentence is sitting, because that's what the tiny black and brown bear was doing. He's sitting on a chair. Now, sitting to me is like, it's an okay word. I mean, it describes what they're doing. They're sitting, but it could be way more interesting. So I'm going to highlight this pink. And now I'm going to think. Instead of sitting, how can I use a really interesting word to describe what this tiny black and brown bear was doing? A word instead of sitting that's maybe more interesting. I'm thinking of a vocab word. I'm thinking of a vocab word that means to kind of like relax and sit back. I'm thinking of the word lounge. So I'm going to change this to lounging. Now I have a much more interesting verb. Once a tiny black and brown bear was lounging on the white chair in the living room. That already makes the story more interesting and fun to read. All right, let's keep going and see if we can find some more verbs that we can change to be more interesting. Suddenly, a giant black beast called a smudge came up. Came. Suddenly, a giant black beast called a smudge came up. Came is a verb, right? If you can come somewhere, you can walk there. But I'm thinking that came is not a good verb. It's boring. It came up. Does that tell you any way of how this giant black beast called a smudge came up? It doesn't. It just says she came. So I'm going to highlight this pink. And now we have to think of a better word than came up. Suddenly, a giant black beast called a smudge wandered up, or meandered up, or sprinted up. Those are all better verbs I could use than come or came, so that we know how smudge is coming up. I'm going to say wandered. And I'm using wandered because it kind of shows that smudge is just like, do, 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 do. Ooh. And then we have, oh no, thought Dimus. Smudge said, you look delicious. No, you look delicious, roared Dimus. Roared is a verb because that's describing how Dimus is speaking, what he's doing. He's roaring. I'm going to highlight it pink because I don't love that he's roaring. I think it's a little strange that Dimus would be roaring at Smudge because Dimus is scared of Smudge. So I might change that one. I'm going to highlight it pink. His little brown ears quivered in fear, quivered. That's a good verb, right? Because that shows he's shaking in fear. I like that one. All right, I'll come up a little bit more, see if we can find any other verbs. Smudge wasn't afraid. She knew he was scared of her ferociousness. She came right up. There's came again. It's just kind of a boring verb. All right, I might come back and change that one too. She came right up to Dimus and put him in her mouth. Put is a verb because if you put something, it's something you're doing. I'm putting this in my mouth. but it's boring. So I'm gonna have to change that to be a more interesting verb. And stuffed him in her mouth. Isn't that good? Or shoved? Or I like stuffed, I think. And stuffed him in her mouth. Well, Diamond didn't like that one bit, so he whipped out his long, sharp nails and scratched her tongue. Oh, no, you didn't, sassed Smudge as she clutched down. There's a good verb. Even harder on poor Dimus. Dimus groaned as he felt Smudge's tight grip on his furry tummy. Just then October pranced over. Pranced is a verb. I could change that if I didn't like to see October prancing. I could do something else. What do you two think you're doing? Barked October. Smudge dropped Dimus, who lost his breath and had to gasp for air. She looked guilty. I was stammered Smudge. You were what? Insisted October. She was trying to eat me, hollered Dimus with a wail. Dimus covered his face with his paws and started sobbing. October glared at Smudge. How could you be so immature? She whispered to Smudge as she patted. Whispered is a verb. Patted is a verb, right? These are all things that October can actually do. She can actually whisper, or she can actually pat. And although I think these verbs are pretty good, I could consider changing them as well. So when I look at whispered, maybe I could say something else, a different way to describe how October's saying. How could you be so immature? She mumbled to Smudge. Kind of like whispered. I'm going to leave it there for now and decide if I want to change it. Okay, so at this point, hopefully you kind of understand what your job is, to go through and highlight in pink any verbs that can be stronger. Now, verbs like run or walk, those are verbs that you can really do a lot of interesting things with, because you can think of a lot of different words that mean the same thing that are more interesting. So instead of run, you could say sprint. Instead of walk, you could say meander, right? You might not know all of these words, but you can certainly include a bunch of vocabulary words. Many of our vocab words are actually verbs. So go through. I'd like you to try to find at least 5 verbs that you can change to be more interesting. Now, if you can't find any verbs in your story, that's okay. You can look at places where you could put a verb. And that just means as you're reading, how can you describe what someone is doing? How can you describe what that character is actually doing? And you'll be surprised at how many verbs you actually have in your story, because every sentence, in order to be complete, has to include a verb. All right, friends, at this point, you should be ready to go and revise for verbs. This is also your last day of revision, because when we come back tomorrow, you're going to start your editing process so that we're ready to eventually share. So last day, make sure all of your revisions are up and tight. Work on those verbs, and I will see you tomorrow. All right, my friends, good luck. Have fun.